Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. We're glad you're here. And now our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
It's Dr. Mike Patterson, your host of the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about what it takes to be a great leader and how to build a great team. I'm glad you're with us. And if you like what you hear on today's episode or any of our past episodes, please leave a review and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. It helps new people find us and benefit from the content we provide. Now let's talk about what's in store for you on today's episode. We're going to talk with a OD leader, a learning leader from the great state of Tennessee, who has spent and grown his career in Europe and the Middle East. I've always been fascinated by the expat lifestyle. Professionals who leave a comfortable life here in the U.S. to live and work overseas. And I can relate to a point. At the start of my career, I was a U.S. Army officer who served in what was at the time West Germany for 3 years. I had the opportunity to travel extensively around Europe. I lived in a couple of different cities in Germany and met some wonderful people. I even managed some German nationals that worked in my office and recognized some cultural differences that affected the way they work. I was even able to speak a little bit of German. But at the end of the day, I was a member of the United States Army, temporarily assigned to serve overseas for a season. And then I was reassigned to a stateside assignment. I came home. More recently, I've had the opportunity to lead training in a wide array of countries and cultural settings from Western Europe to Asia and Latin America and even the Middle East. And I've learned a great deal from these events and again, met some incredible people. However, I did come back home after the events and resume my life in California. But I have often wondered, what would it be like to spend your entire career outside of your home country? What's it like to spend your career developing leaders in a cultural setting very different from your own? What are the challenges? What would you need to learn? Could I thrive over there in the same way I thrive here? Or does thriving even mean the same thing? While people are people, there are some unique challenges and changes one needs to make to be effective cross-culturally. Well, today, my curiosity will be satisfied, at least to a point, as we address these questions and much more with today's guest. Berry Lumpkins is currently the Global Director of Organizational Development at NKT Group, based in Copenhagen, Denmark. Prior to joining the NKT Group, Berry held a number of global and regional roles with DP World, first Abu Dhabi Bank, Zurich Insurance Group, the global shipping giant Maersk and Siemens. He was always focused in areas of learning, leadership development, talent, and culture, and he was based around the world, mostly Europe and the Middle East. Berry holds a master's degree in ethics from the University of Wales in the United Kingdom and a Bachelor of Arts in philosophy from Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee. Berry is now a dual national. He holds citizenship in Sweden and the United States, and he currently lives in Sweden with his wife, 2 children, and a cat. It's great to have Berry on the show today.
Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about better business results, stronger teams, more successful careers, and happier lives. Along the way, we hope to bust some biases, build some bridges, and have some fun. We're glad you're here. And now, our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
My friend from far away, Berry Lumpkins. Berry, welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. It's great to have you here.
Great, Mike. Thank you so much for having me. It's really, really exciting to be here.
Now, tell us where you are today. We're going to explore your worldwide tour de force career, but where are you talking to me from this evening?
I am actually speaking to you from home today in a relatively small town in Sweden called Lund. It's a very historic town, one of the oldest universities in Europe. But I'm based technically now in Copenhagen, Denmark, which is just across the border. I make that trek a few times a week.
All right. Well, I think you're our first guest from Loom, Sweden. So you have that honor for the record books here. Barry, in my introduction, I talked about how some of us fantasize about a career like yours, being an expat, working overseas in exotic places. And then we wonder, what are some of the challenges that you face? What are some of the rewarding experiences you've had? Maybe some of the lessons you've learned. And that's the nature of our conversation today. But I want to begin with just giving you an opportunity to tell a bit about your background, tell your story. How did you go from the middle of Tennessee and find your way to the other side of the world?
Yes, well, it's been an interesting journey, Mike. And when anytime I have a conversation like this, and certainly preparing to speak with you here, it gives you this time to reflect on your journey. And sometimes you forget about all the interesting things that have happened along the way. I was born in Nashville. I was born to pretty modest means in Tennessee. And actually, due to my father's job, I moved around incredibly extensively as a child. So my 12 years of core school in the US, I went to 11 different schools, actually.
Wow.
Yeah. So moving around and kind of, meeting people for the first time, et cetera, was just part of kind of the DNA of growing up. And essentially what happened was I ended up going to a university in Tennessee, Austin Peay State University, after moving around mostly in the Southeast US. And there were a few things that happened. I just, for some reason, I got this itch. I really, really wanted to go study abroad. And at that time, many years ago, there weren't as many English-speaking graduate programs abroad as there are today. So the natural place for me to gravitate to go was actually the UK.
Okay.
Just because of languages. And at the time, I was studying something very, very different than what I'm doing now, which is I did my bachelor's degree in philosophy, which I also kind of fell into a little bit by accident and kind of fell in love with. And so I applied and got into several graduate programs in the UK and ended
Hey, Barry,
up.
I hate to interrupt you, but at any point did your parents ask, what are you going to do with a philosophy degree?
Well, they did. And it was something I just fell in love with. And to be honest with you, Mike, I think I had so much fascination with meeting people. I met some exchange students, first in high school, but then also at university. And there was something about that field of study. It started drawing me to academia, which was really where I at least thought I was heading. And that just kind of lent itself again to going abroad.
Okay.
And just sort of followed this path, which the big next step was, of course, going to the UK.
And I jokingly asked about your choice of major. My son was a philosophy major, and believe me, I asked that question on numerous occasions. In fact, every time I wrote a tuition check, I think I asked that question. So it worked out for him, and it worked out for you. So being a philosophy major is a good thing for many folks. So I'm glad that worked out. So you're in the UK. You're studying. Are you continuing your studies in philosophy, or did you change gears? You're sitting in university, grad school in the UK. Kind of pick up the story from there.
Yeah, well, the story actually, I got into several universities there, and this starts a pattern of me maybe making choices that weren't the most obvious ones. I could have went to London or Liverpool, other places. Instead, I went to a very, very tiny university in the middle of nowhere in Wales. And I chose that university mainly because this becomes a pattern as well, because of the great interactions I had with the people there during the application process. And I just thought, you know what, I'm going to do something very different. It's a tiny university that really, University of Lampeter, Wales, that focuses on philosophy, ethics, religion, and classics. And it's actually the third oldest university in the UK after Oxford and Cambridge.
Wow.
And so I decided, you know what, I'm going to take a chance and go there. And it was just an incredible experience, I have to say.
So I think we're probably going to pick up on a theme here. Relationships matter. And
Yes.
even as a young man choosing a university setting to spend a couple of years of your life, it was the people there, the relationships that you were forming that really drew you to this decision.
It's true, and this will continue to play out as the story unfolds. But I ended up going into an MA program in ethics, which and it became clear to me again at that moment, at time, that I was going to continue in academia and actually probably teach. And as my master's degree came to a close, I then started applying to PhD programs, which I got into a couple. One direction going into a niche area of philosophy, bioethics, and the other into science fiction studies, actually.
Okay. There may be a connection there somewhere, but that's probably another conversation.
Yeah. But what ended up happening was while I was a student there, I ended up meeting a young lady from Sweden. And I sort of came to one of these many kind of fork in the road decision points in my life and my career, where I could either stay in the UK for what would have been probably another 3 to 4 years working on a PhD, or I could pause what I was doing and follow her back to Sweden. And she's now my wife. So obviously I chose romance and came to Sweden and followed her here.
So this is a love story. I wasn't expecting that twist in the plot, but it was a relationship and a woman and the ultimate relationship that caused you to take the turn to go to Sweden. So you're newly married, or eventually you get married. You're in Sweden. You're still a guy from Tennessee that sort of talks like a guy from Tennessee, now highly educated with a graduate degree in ethics. What do you do?
Well, I then sort of repositioned, and I was basically was thinking to go into a PhD program at a Swedish university and continue along the same track. And out of the blue, someone tapped me on the shoulder one day, just completely randomly, and asked me about doing some consultancy work, actually teaching business English at companies. And I thought, you know what, I'll give it a try. And I really fell in love with it. Not necessarily the teaching business English, but the teaching in terms of, which is very much, there's a red thread here connected with what I was intentionally going to do with what I do now, which is helping people develop and be the best versions of themselves. And I ended up doing some consulting work at a number of different companies, and then ended up doing that work at one particular company, and I can say the name, it was Siemens, that ended up sort of tapping me on the shoulder and hiring me into their learning and development team. And that's really where this whole thing started.
So that is the origin story of your career in leadership and employee development. You thought you kind of had this idea in mind, this feeling in your heart that you wanted to teach, but you're doing it in a different way, in a corporate environment instead of an academic environment. And from experience, I can tell you the money is much better in the business environment. So maybe that was a good choice. So that makes perfect sense how you got into the leadership and employee development space. Now, tell us a little bit about, so you're in Siemens now, you're starting to work in this field, but your career journey is taking you through a number of industries and geographies. You need a scorecard to keep up with, or a travel log to keep up with where you are in your career, Berry. Tell us a little bit about some of the twists and turns through other industries, employers, and geographies.
Yeah, so I was lucky enough. I mean, to jump into, and I'm I consider myself a proud alumni of Siemens. I was lucky enough to really start my career in such a big, diverse organization. So even within that company, I was able to be based in three different countries, but also essentially in three different industries because of how vast. So I within Siemens, I worked in oil and gas, in renewable energy, but then also in healthcare. And that just kind of started the ball rolling. The great thing about doing the kind of work that I do is that it can be applied in all kinds of different contexts and industries. And so I was then able to go on and do some work in financial services, in banking, in shipping, and transport and logistics, energy transmission, et cetera. So it's been great to actually learn something about all these different industries, but also to take my then experiences and apply them into a new context.
You mentioned a red thread that weaves through your career as you bounce around to these different through these different industries and geographies. What have you found consistent about your work and leadership and employee development and organizational development? What is consistent across all of the different settings you've worked in?
Well, I would say so. If I actually did some thinking, leading up to this conversation, some reflection. I mean, I've actually physically been to about 50 countries. Many of those I've been to numerous times, and some I've actually stayed in extensive periods of time. So I've been to places that many Americans would got to experience, and it's been amazing. I've been to Pakistan many times, and Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, and Saudi, and so on. But the more places I go, and on top of that, by the way, I'll say I've probably worked with team members, leaders, and colleagues from, let's add another 50 countries onto that. What's become really, really clear to me over time is that, in my experience, people everywhere are a lot more similar than they are dissimilar. And it just continues to ring true the more people I meet. That's kind of my biggest takeaway. And thinking about what would be the advice for someone who might want to think to embark on a journey like this of going to different places. If we talk about just people in general, I think there's just a couple of things. I mean, that work everywhere. And one of those is listening more than you speak when you meet people. I think it's really about being genuinely curious. My experience is people really love to tell you the stories about their traditions and their food and things like that. And then lastly, it's just kind of being respectful. And I know we might dive a little bit more into leadership, but those are just kind of three principles. Those work everywhere. I haven't found any culture or anyone I've met where those three principles don't work. And if there is somewhere where that doesn't work, I would actually love to hear about it from your listeners.
Yeah, but I'm not sure I'd want to go there and work there with overbearing, obnoxious people that talk about themselves all the time. I think your approach is probably wiser. So I appreciate your point about, at our core, people are more similar than different, and I've had the same experience. I've had the opportunity to do some work in different parts of the world. And I felt that. I've always sensed that. And I think your advice is right on target, Barry. But, even though we are maybe more similar than dissimilar at our core, there are still some differences. You're not suggesting that we shouldn't invest in intercultural or cross-cultural communication training for our teams and organizations that are working in environments that are unlike their own. What advice do you have for organizations on that front?
Well, so if I rewind a little bit, Mike, if you spoke to Barry 12 to 15 years ago, I was at a point in my career where I was working at a location with a few thousand employees that, by the nature of the business, on short notice, they would send a 12 to 15 person project team to a remote location for 6 weeks. It could be Morocco. It could be Siberia, for example. That kind of context, I was actually responsible for setting up these kind of cross-cultural workshops, et cetera. And in that particular context, I would say it was money well spent and valued. But I think the danger that I've now gravitated away more broadly in recommending that approach is that ultimately it often leads down the path of stereotyping. And the more people you meet, and we'll just take as an example, a typical stereotype, Germans are always on time kind of thing. And I've worked a lot with Germany, having worked for Siemens. I spent many, many trips to Munich, et cetera, and I've had lots of colleagues and team members. And I can tell you, I also know lots of German folks that are not so punctual. So the more people you meet, you start to realize that these stereotypes are kind of boxing in people. And so I would always approach that type of learning and investment with just an asterisk that the moment you hear people start talking in absolutes, again, this typical example, Germans are always on time, I would be a bit suspicious of that.
Yeah, I think that's probably true for any stereotype. I think we have to question the validity of any broad, unsupported assertion like that. Barry, you've experienced success in your career. Are there certain people, perhaps certain influences in your professional life that you would attribute much of your success to, leaders perhaps that have been especially influential? I'd love to hear about the people who impacted you in positive ways. And then if there are people that you wanted to not be like, I'm happy to hear about them as well.
Yeah. And Mike, of course. And again, reflecting, whenever you have a conversation like this, it really allows you to step back and think, I have been so lucky. I am so grateful. I can't even count the number of amazing, both direct leaders, but colleagues and kind of mentors, official and unofficial, that I've worked with. And I really, in thinking about this, I kind of boiled it down to what I would describe as kind of 3 great leadership lessons I've learned from people directly. And then also 3 not so great. And all of them, I have actually some direct stories and experiences. So maybe I'll start with kind of the 3 great leadership lessons. And the first one for me is this idea of the little things matter. And I'll give you an example. Is when I did my first expat assignment with my family. So with my family in tow, and I have 2 children now who are 13 and 9, and they were much younger then. But when I did my first expat assignment, moving to a new continent, moving into a role that largely I didn't have experience in, the company was kind of taking a chance on me. And when we arrived, this was in Dubai, when we arrived at our hotel, because it was a few weeks before we could move into our house, waiting on my family was a dozen roses and an amazing sort of goodie package for my children, with a handwritten note from my skip manager, the group CHRO, that basically said something along the lines of, if there's, thank you so much for your family coming here. And it was actually just to my wife, the roses. If there's anything I can do along the way, please reach out to me directly. And he was signed personally by him, his email and his mobile number. And by the way, he actually followed up with email directly to my wife as well, reinforcing, you can call me anytime. And I have to say that gesture was so powerful. It made such a difference, not just for me, but also my family. And I've tried to take that forward and try to keep it in mind with my teams. It doesn't have to be big gestures that you do, but they just need to be deliberate. They need to be genuine, and they need to be thoughtful.
Yeah, I love that. The authentic nature of him or her reaching out to your family like that. And oftentimes it's the family that bears much, if not most, of the burden for these.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You're doing what you do and love to do, and it's your passion, and you're excited about this fresh start, but your family is being pulled along for the ride, and maybe they're more anxious and less excited about this new situation than you are. So that step is huge. I love that point. You got two more, and I just want to remind our listeners, or tell our listeners, that you wrote an article that was published in an online HR magazine, HR Manager, I think. But in any case, I'm going to have this link in our show notes to encourage people to go check out the article and actually read what you wrote, even though you're telling us what you wrote. So what's the second lesson learned?
Well, the second lesson is many, many years ago. I mean, long before now, on every company's strategy and sustainability reports, as it should be, it talks about inclusion and diversity. But many years ago, I worked for a leader who couldn't have been more different from me. I mean, this guy is a numbers genius. I'm rubbish with numbers, Mike. He could challenge executives very confidently. At least at that time, I couldn't do it. But there was one thing that he did that was so ahead of its time. He just constantly said to me, Barry, you've got to constantly surround yourself with people different from you, but you've got to genuinely listen to them. And he did that. I mean, and I worked for this person twice, and I couldn't be more different, North and South Pole, from him. And I still keep in touch with him and still use him as a sounding board, because again, he comes from such a different place than I do. But for me, I've then taken that and applied it, and it's served me well. And of course, now we know, as it should be, that the whole topic of inclusion and diversity is at the top of every company's agenda, more or less. And there's a business case for it, right? It's incredibly compelling.
And I bet part of that business case is how you were developed as a leader as a result of being around this person who was different, but embraced those differences. And I bet the business case also includes how your perspective influenced some of the maybe decisions or approaches or plans that this leader made. I think it's a two-way street.
Yeah, it is. And I would say, Mike, if I could sum it up, I think I helped him with the people side. Okay. And maybe that's why he brought back to the relationship, the red thread again. So then we're on to the third big insight. And again, I'll say, for me, these, at least in my experience, these work regardless of culture or industry, et cetera. And that third one was really a big moment of truth. In I think many people's career, certainly for me, was when you make a mistake. And so some years ago, I was at an internal kind of global HR meeting, and I ran into a very senior stakeholder that reminded me of basically, I dropped the ball on something I was supposed to do, and it was important. And that person gave me very direct, warranted feedback on the spot. Now, it just so happened that my leader was at the same conference. And so I just remember this moment and this exchange is kind of tattooed in my brain. I went and found my leader and just said, look, I need to let you know I messed up. I've jeopardized my relationship with this senior stakeholder. And he simply just asked me a few key questions. He said, so what did you do? So I said, look, I apologize. I own the mistake. I said, let's clarify what I need to do to make this right. He then said to me something along the lines, and you agreed on next steps and how to sort it. I said, yes. And then he asked me, great question, what did you learn? Well, I learned that something I still hold dear is that, if there's any ambiguity in next steps, especially with a very important stakeholder, you always got to ensure that you have kind of 100% alignment. There's no misunderstandings. And he then said something to me that was just so invigorating. he just said to me that, Barry, you just told me everything I need to know about you. That some of the most important moments in our career is when we make mistakes. And he then said, I make them too. But the question is, what do we learn? You could have covered this up, but you came to me immediately and told me about it. Well done.
Wow.
And that lesson is, I just, anytime anyone on my team, over my career has had a misstep. And again, we all do. I do. I'm sure you do. We all do. The key is sort of coming clean about it and bringing it to the surface and not trying to cover it up.
I think something that the scenario you're describing also expresses is the fact that it was safe for you to go to your leader and share what had happened. And apparently you weren't fearful of getting fired or, some serious repercussions that would last. But your first thought was, I'm going to go to this person and share what happened and trust that they will create a learning experience out of this for me versus, penalize me in some harsh way. And I think that element of safety is a really important part of what you just described.
It's so important. And ironically, I remember now after that moments where I've had similar discussions with my team members, and they have actually come back to me. Somebody who was on my team years ago, recently, she came back to me and said, I remember when you had that conversation with me. And it's just, it's something I just, I hope I'll continue to pay forward, certainly, because again, we all make mistakes, right? It's then what do we do once we know we've made a mistake?
Absolutely. Now you also said there were some other lessons or some sort of, there's a dark side to these three truths or things that you learn that maybe weren't so easily learned, hard lessons, perhaps. Tell us some of those.
So I went through the kind of what I would say are the three great leadership lessons, and then I would say there's three not so great leadership lessons. And I'll be careful here, Mike, not to be too specific because someone may sort of figure what I'm talking about. But the first one I want to talk about is something that I have seen throughout my career, and then unfortunately, I worked for someone directly who was kind of a master of this, and I'll call it panic delegation. So, and I'll give an example. So I worked in a context at one point where once or twice a week, this leader would come out of a meeting with a very worried look on his face, look to grab the first two people from the team he saw, regardless of whether or not the topic had anything to do with their work, pull them into a room, and then proceed to give them a task to do, on short notice. And it happened to me about a month into my tenure in this company, where I was pulled in with another colleague and told, okay, it's the end of business on today's Wednesday, close of business Friday. I need a proposal for a global graduate program with these two business schools. I need costs. I need everything. Do it. Drop everything you're doing and do it. And that proceeded to happen again and again. Now, of course, the flip side of that is that, when this happens again and again, and there's no sort of momentum behind it, it ends up, demotivating and making your work sort of not feel like it really means anything, et cetera. And what ended up happening in this case was, I found out later, was that there was a passing remark to this leader from the CHRO, maybe we should explore at some point a graduate program. And then it proceeded in 48 hours, we have to get some proposal together, which meant that we had to stop doing a lot of other things. It also meant that we had to jeopardize relationships with third-party partners because we had to ask them to pull something together quickly. And so that whole panic delegation, I've seen it in many different contexts. That doesn't go down anywhere. It's not good for your team, and it's toxic.
Yeah. Lesson learned there is keep a low profile or be off site on those meeting days for your leader.
Well, actually, that's what ended up happening. It's kind of like that look in the person's eye was like, okay, hide, go for a walk or something.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
And another lesson or two for us.
Sure. One other not so great lesson for me is actually exactly that. Is when leaders, it's all about me, i.e. the leader. And I'll give you another personal example where, and it revolves around the same question. So some years ago, I started in a role. On my second week, I was supposed to have just a coffee catch up with the skip manager, the CHRO. And before that conversation, I was brought into a room, and my line manager very seriously asked me a question. So, what are you going to say? Now, I was a bit confused because I was like, okay, well, maybe I've misunderstood. Am I supposed to be presenting something, or no? What are you going to say? And he proceeded to kind of say that, whenever you have a conversation with that person, I need to know exactly what you're going to say. Now, that moment, Mike, I had a knot in my stomach that was physically painful because I realized 2 weeks in, I think I've made a big mistake because I didn't see this coming. Now, you fast forward sort of 5-6 months, and I had decided after discussing with my wife that this was not for me, and I was going to do something very radical, which was I was just going to resign. And I went into that person's office, that leader's office, and basically said, look, this isn't working out. And, but I want to hand over things and leave in a good standing. So can we just agree when I'm going to leave? And ironically, the same question came up again. So what are you going to say?
Oh,
and the worry was, what am I going to say to other people about why I'm leaving? And I just proceeded to say, agree, I'll say whatever you want me to say. And so then there was, of course, a narrative told that was kind of crafted by that person that made them look good. But of course, I also got about 25 WhatsApp messages after it was made public that, we all know, of course, why you're leaving because of this person. But the thing for me, Mike, is that as a leader, chances are you've had your chance in the spotlight. You're there because of that, because of successes. So why not instead look for each and every opportunity to put all of your people out front and let them shine rather than just thinking about yourself?
Yeah, it's certainly reflective of a lack of confidence on that leader's part, the lack of safety in his world. Yeah, that wouldn't be a good place to be. Berry, we're starting to descend for our landing here on this episode. I can't resist this question. Can you tell us the craziest, weirdest, most awkward moment you've had working in a very different culture that now looking back, you just have to laugh?
Let's see, Mike. Well, one of the things that happened when I went back to, I've worked twice and been based in the UAE, and when I went back the second time, I was so eager, just excited to start back in my new company when I went back, and there you typically you don't shake hands with women unless they extend their hand. And I was so eager, depending on what family they're from, and I was so eager to shake hands with one of my new colleagues. I sort of stuck my hand out right when I went in the office, and she said, "Oh, you've worked here before, but I don't shake hands." So that was a little bit embarrassing since I had already been there previously, that I had forgotten. But it was just down to me being so excited to kind of be back in the region. So that's one that comes to mind. So I was a bit embarrassed, but we had a laugh about it, she and I, many times later.
It sounds like she responded very gracefully.
She did, and she's fantastic.
So Berry, languages, are you one of these guys that speaks 17 different languages at this point, or have just a few served you well?
Well, like many Americans, not all, But like many Americans, I mean, I so regret now, considering my experiences, that I didn't invest more time in languages when I was younger. I know many words in Spanish, etc., but I have managed to teach myself Swedish. I speak more or less fluently. But other than that, no. I know, obviously, because the languages are similar, words in Danish and Norwegian, but no, I speak Swedish fluently. But otherwise, that's about the extent of it, Mike.
Well, you are doing better than I am. I've been married to a native Spanish speaker for 28 years, and my Spanish is awful, minimal. So you have far exceeded me. Barry, the final substantive question I want to ask you is the same question I ask everyone as we come to the end of our conversation here. And that's, what's one piece of advice that you would give to a listener today that they can start doing, they can apply immediately, that would have a positive effect on their leadership effectiveness?
I'm actually going to go back to one of my tips just for people in general, if you interact with others from across the globe. And that is, and I would say it applies for leaders as well. If I could say one thing, listen more than you speak. Genuinely listen. I think that's something that a lot of people could use some work on.
I think that's great advice. I think wise men have been saying that for centuries, and we still haven't all learned that lesson. So I think it's a great lesson to continue teaching and be reminded of. Barry, if someone listening today has enjoyed this conversation with you, eavesdropping on our conversation, and would like to continue the conversation with you directly, what's the best way to connect with you?
Oh, the easiest and best way is on LinkedIn. That's where I'm the most active and spend a lot of time there. So I would love to hear from anyone who'd like to continue the conversation.
That's awesome. And we'll put that link in the show notes. Again, we're linking the 3 great leadership lessons article in the show notes. Barry, thank you for being a great guest. Fascinating conversation. I've known you for a long time, but I've never heard your full story in this form. So I loved it. There's some things I'm taking away here, in addition to the listen more than you speak, show respect, relationships matter, make mistakes learning opportunities rather than opportunities for repercussions and punishment, and be authentic, make it safe. All these lessons that I teach, you teach, many of us teach, apply no matter where we are in the world. People are in many ways similar. And so let's do the right thing for all people and treat all people well and respectfully. So with that, to my listeners, thank you for being part of this conversation. Until we meet again, remember, it's mission first, people always, and we'll talk again soon. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to create a stronger, more people-centric and empowered culture for your organization, visit drmikepatterson.com.